the IFS, who were the think tank criticising reform's costings, have also been pretty critical of the costings in both the Tory and Labour manifestos by saying that they are also skirting over what's really needed for public finances. So I think that might wash over many people, and there will be a focus on the policies. And yeah, I think that's where Reform are making hay effectively and positioning themselves as an alternative to this election, and as you say, as a protest vote.
Britain faces a generation under Labour if people vote for reform. It's the latest warning from the Conservatives. Yesterday, the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, admitted on Times Radio that it's very unlikely the Tories will win the election.
It's possible to win the election. Do I accept it's not the most likely outcome? Yes, I accept that. I'm a realist. But I also think that when people start to narrow down on this focus, and in particular, I've noticed this with talking to people on the doorstep where they have been perhaps toying voting in another direction and then realising that just gives Starmer more power. And no one, I think, at this stage thinks that it would be in the benefit of this country, to the benefit of themselves, their own household budgets and the tax that would come upon it, to have a massive Starmer majority.
Okay, so you're saying it's, in terms of a Tory victory, it's unlikely but possible. Is that fair?
I mean, look, I think that's the realistic position, isn't it? I mean, I live in the real world. And
I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it.
And so, let's not try and pretend black is white, but let's not also try and say that just because opinion polls say X, that's what will happen in the ballot box, because as I mentioned, in 2015, 16 and 17, pollsters were the ones who ended up with egg on their faces. It was on your programme that I raised this issue of a supermajority, and I stand by that. It's also true to say, as I said on your programme last week, in opening that conversation, that we're also fighting for every vote. No one's voted at all at this point. And we believe that when you set out, for example, those enormous tax rises we're going to be subject to under Labour, and our programme, fully costed with tax cuts, people will actually look at that again and say, hold on a minute, perhaps we are rushing too far into this. And the risks of a blank cheque for Starmer are horrendous for this country. And it doesn't do the country any good to have that kind of size majority for Starmer.
You're a cabinet minister. There's a cabinet minister quoted in the Times. Rishi getting us 140 to 180 MPs now would be a very good result. I don't think there are any other options left. Would you agree with that?
Well, look, I never comment on sort of anonymous quotes, but what I would say is we're still fighting for absolutely every single vote, which is absolutely the right thing to do, and warning of the dangers of Labour. But what I said last week stands. A blank cheque, a supermajority, is a dangerous thing.
Well, the Conservatives are accusing Labour of planning to scrap inheritance tax exemptions for farmers who want to pass their land on to their children. Now, Labour hasn't ruled out changing inheritance tax rules, but says the Tories are making the claims to distract from holes in their own tax plans. Meanwhile, Reform UK launched its manifesto in Merthyr Tydfil in Wales yesterday, calling it a contract with the country. They're placing an emphasis on stemming net migration while also pledging tax cuts and a commitment to fix public services. However, the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies has said its spending plans don't add up. But Reform candidate Dan Barker says parts of the immigration plan could work.
And what we're saying is we would apply a higher rate of tax to foreign workers. Business would have a choice. They could employ a British worker at a lower cost, or if they desperately need those skills and they're not available in the UK, they could bring that foreign worker in and pay a higher rate of tax. So it's a choice for business. In the longer term, what we think we will see is it will encourage and incentivise businesses to invest in growing their own talent in the UK and the British workforce.
Well, let's talk all things election now with Joe Mays, UK politics reporter for Bloomberg. Morning, Joe.
Good morning.
Starting with Reform, I mean, this issue about the costings of their manifesto, it is true, they are incredibly vague and the independent analysts say their figures just don't add up. But will that really make much of an impact on their poll numbers? I mean, isn't there a sense that really people are attracted to Reform almost as a protest vote against the Conservatives, but also to an extent against Labour? Or could this hurt them, the questions over the affordability of their plans?
Yeah, I don't think it hurts them that much. I think you're right that the core appeal of Reform comes from having a pretty charismatic leader, Nigel Farage, and focusing on issues which they say the other parties aren't focusing on, having these very strong lines on immigration, having these quite, in Farage's words, out-of-the-box ideas when it comes to the economy, which might, get the attention of some voters who might otherwise not want to vote or be considered to vote for the Conservative Party. So, and recognise also that the IFS, who were the think tank criticising reform's costings, have also been pretty critical of the costings in both the Tory and Labour manifestos by saying that they are also skirting over what's really needed for public finances. So I think that might wash over many people, and there will be a focus on the policies. And yeah, I think that's where Reform are making hay effectively and positioning themselves as an alternative to this election, and as you say, as a protest vote. And that's why I think they could do pretty well.
Sticking with Reform, another of their candidates has been found to have made controversial comments about Hitler, among others. He's called Jack Aaron. What's he been saying, Joe?
Some quite strange things. He said that he described Adolf Hitler as brilliant at using personality traits to inspire people to action. He was trying to make the point, I think, that he was trying to argue there's a difference between Hitler being an evil person, but also being kind of a capable and effective person at achieving his ends. But obviously, that kind of gets slightly lost in media coverage, and you end up becoming this big source of controversy. I think he also made some controversial comments about the Syrian dictator Assad, calling him gentle by nature. And this is the kind of thing that will be seized on and has been seized on, and does damage, I think, your cause slightly, and is rather unwise use of words.
Yeah, he's standing in the constituency of Welwyn Hatfield. Just to give you the full list of candidates there, you got Jack Aaron, as discussed, for Reform UK, Sarah Butcher for the Green Party, Andrew Lewin for Labour, John Munro for the Lib Dems, and Grant Shapps for the Conservatives. Talking of the Conservatives, they are warning that a vote for reform will lead to a generation of socialism under Labour. I mean, it's really interesting, this, Joe, this narrative around a supermajority and almost an admittance by senior ministers that they're likely to lose, but as a result, trying to encourage people to, I don't know, vote Conservative to have a smaller Labour majority, which seems slightly weird. But is that where they are? Do they really think that's going to work?
I think that is pretty much where they are, and it seems to me a slightly strange strategy in that I think you're right. They're effectively saying we need to have a large opposition to hold Starmer to account. But what they're effectively saying is we need opposition MPs, and that doesn't necessarily mean you should have to vote Conservative in the mind of a voter. You're really relying on voters really believing you that they need to tactically effectively vote Conservative, even if they want to vote for reform, say, to get a Conservative MP where Labour might otherwise win. But I think this is requiring a level of kind of voter engagement and thought that I think is not the case for most voters, who often just want to turn up on polling day and vote for the party that most represents their views. So it's a pretty tough sell, I think. And also, if they're claiming there'll be a kind of generation of socialism under Labour, and that's mainly because they argue Labour will expand the franchise. They argue that Labour will expand votes to prisoners, to migrants, and so on, to up to 16-year-olds. But if Labour has a parliamentary majority, it can do that. It wouldn't necessarily have to have a supermajority to do that. So it's a pretty narrow argument they're making. I think I'm not completely sold on it.
And just on Labour, more questions for the party over their tax plans. The Conservatives accusing them of planning to scrap inheritance tax exemptions for farmers. There is also confusion over Labour's position on council tax bans. The Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, said yesterday that Labour had no plans to change council tax rates, but we know that language sometimes can be accused of implying that down the line you might actually change tax plans or tax policy there. Similar wording Keir Starmer has used in the past. This issue of tax, Joe, is this the issue that Labour find most uncomfortable?
Yes, I think it is, because I think the Labour Party internally senses that it is on the cusp of power, and it wants to give itself the freedom, when in power, to be able to come up with policies, tax and spend measures that will do what's needed for the public finances. And that means, therefore, not, as you say, ruling out certain measures that you might like to do, because you don't want to be accused of breaking the trust of the public early on in your time in government if you do get into government. So that's why, as you say, use this language of no plans, because you can then say later down the line, well, there are no plans then, but there are plans now, to see how difficult the public finances are. But yeah, Labour really want to kind of really bat away any questions around tax beyond what they've said about ruling out income tax increases, ruling out VAT increases, ruling out national insurance. Everything else, they left this sense of being on the table, because they don't want to give the Tories attack lines to use against them.
Yeah, George H.W. Bush famously said in, 1988, read my lips, no new taxes, and then raise taxes. So the language in election campaigns around tax, always going to be closely scrutinised. Joe, appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Joe Mays there, UK politics reporter for Bloomberg.